The bass guitar spun through the air like a helicopter blade, and in the 3 seconds it took to come back down, Kurt Cobain's entire world changed. September 9, 1992, MTV Video Music Awards at the Pauley Pavilion in Los Angeles. Nirvana had just finished playing Lithium in front of 10,000 people and millions watching on live television, and Krist Novoselic, their bassist, had just made a decision that would turn a triumphant performance into a medical emergency. But here's what nobody talks about. In those 3 seconds while that bass was spinning, Kurt saw something in Krist's eyes that terrified him more than any stage dive or crowd surge ever had. He saw his best friend, the guy who'd been there since the beginning, the guy who understood him better than almost anyone, about to get seriously hurt, and there was absolutely nothing he could do to stop it from happening. 6 hours earlier, backstage, tension was already thick enough to cut with a guitar pick. Nirvana had been nominated for Best New Artist and Best Alternative Video, but that wasn't what had Kurt pacing back and forth in the dressing room like a caged animal. MTV had given them specific instructions earlier that day. Play your hit. Smile for the cameras. Don't cause trouble. Be professional. Everything Kurt hated about the music industry wrapped up in 3 sentences that made his skin crawl. "They want us to be good little rock stars," Kurt said to Krist, his voice dripping with sarcasm and barely contained anger. "Perform our circus trick and go home like trained animals." Krist was sprawled on a couch, his impossibly long legs taking up half the room. He'd been watching Kurt pace for the past 20 minutes, recognizing the familiar signs of pre-show anxiety mixed with that anti-establishment rage he'd seen dozens of times before. "So what do you want to do about it?" Kurt's eyes lit up with that mischievous spark that Krist had learned to both love and fear over the years they'd been playing together. "Give them something they'll never forget, something that reminds everyone we're not their puppets." What happened next was pure Nirvana chaos at its finest. Instead of opening with the familiar, expected intro to Lithium, Kurt started playing the wrong song entirely. The opening chords of Rate Me, their most controversial unreleased track, the song MTV had specifically told them not to perform under any circumstances, rang out through the Pauley Pavilion. MTV executives in the control booth went into immediate panic mode, yelling into headsets. Then Kurt switched to Lithium. The whole thing lasted maybe 5 seconds, but it sent a crystal-clear message to everyone watching. "We do what we want. You don't control us." Kurt threw himself into the performance with an intensity that bordered on violence. He wasn't just singing the words to Lithium, he was exorcising demons, channeling every ounce of frustration he felt about fame, about commercial success, about being turned into a commodity instead of an artist, about losing control of his own life and music. Dave Grohl was pounding the drums so hard you could actually see the kick drum moving across the stage with each thundering hit. Krist played his bass like he was trying to break it into pieces, his fingers attacking the strings with raw aggression. The song built to its explosive climax, that moment where the quiet, almost whispered verse explodes into the screaming chorus. Kurt smashed his guitar into his amplifier repeatedly, creating a wall of feedback that physically hurt to hear if you were standing anywhere near the stage. Dave kicked over his cymbals, drums, and hardware crashing in every direction. The crowd was on their feet, screaming themselves hoarse. And that's when Krist decided to throw his bass guitar straight up into the air. It wasn't spur of the moment. Krist had been doing this move at shows for months now, a signature bit of showmanship where he'd toss his bass straight up 20 or 30 feet in the air, let it spin like a baton, and catch it perfectly on the way down. It looked impossible, death-defying, completely spontaneous. He'd done it dozens of times without any incident whatsoever. At the Paramount Theater in Seattle, at the Reading Festival in England just weeks before, at small clubs up and down the West Coast during their endless touring. But what nobody knew, what Krist would only admit years later in interviews, was that he was absolutely exhausted that night at the VMAs. They'd been on tour for what felt like forever, playing nearly every single night, traveling constantly, barely sleeping more than a few hours between shows. The success of Nevermind had turned their lives into a relentless grind. Chris was running on pure adrenaline and very little else. His body pushed far past its limits. And the stage at the Poly Pavilion had completely different lighting than the clubs and small theaters they were used to playing night after night. Brighter, more disorienting, with spotlights that created strange shadows and made it much harder to track a spinning object against the darkness above. Kurt saw Chris wind up for the throw, and his stomach dropped instantly. He couldn't explain it rationally, couldn't articulate exactly why, but something felt profoundly wrong about this particular throw in this particular moment. Maybe it was the way Chris' shoulders looked tense instead of loose. Maybe it was the slight wobble in his stance. Maybe it was just pure instinct, that sixth sense that tells you when someone you care about is in danger. He opened his mouth to shout a warning across the stage, but the feedback from his destroyed guitar was far too loud for his voice to carry. Chris couldn't have heard him anyway over the wall of noise. The bass left Chris' hands and spun up into the air, rotating perfectly at first, the stage lights catching the glossy black finish. 1 rotation, 2 rotations, 3 rotations. Time seemed to slow down in that horrible way it does when you're watching something terrible happen and you're completely powerless to stop it. Kurt watched his best friend standing there, arms spread wide, eyes tracking the bass as it spun above him, ready to catch it just like he'd done so many times before. But Chris' timing was off. Just slightly, maybe half a second, but in a move that required split-second precision, half a second was everything. The bass was coming down fast, spinning at the wrong angle, and Chris' hands weren't quite in the right position. He reached up to catch it, fingers grasping for the familiar neck, but instead of grabbing the smooth wood, the bass rotated one more time, and the headstock came straight down and smashed directly into Chris' forehead with a sickening crack that could be heard even over the feedback and screaming crowd. Chris' head snapped back violently from the impact like he'd been punched by a heavyweight boxer. His arms dropped to his sides instantly, suddenly boneless. His knees buckled underneath him. And then all 6 feet 7 inches of him collapsed onto the stage like a building being demolished, falling straight down with absolutely no attempt to catch himself. The bass clattered loudly beside him, still vibrating from the impact. For one terrible second that felt like an entire hour, the entire Poly Pavilion went completely silent. 10,000 people held their breath simultaneously. Was this part of the show? Was Chris hurt? Then someone screamed, and then everyone was screaming, and the silence shattered into pure chaos. Kurt dropped his guitar without even thinking about it and ran across the stage as fast as his legs would carry him. He didn't calculate his next move, didn't worry about the cameras still filming or the live broadcast or what millions of people watching at home would think. He just ran on pure instinct and fear. His boots slipped slightly on the polished stage surface, and he went down hard on his knees, sliding the last few feet like a baseball player stealing second base, and grabbed Chris' shoulders with both hands. Chris, can you hear me?" His voice came out higher than normal, tight with fear and barely controlled panic. No response at all. Chris' eyes were completely closed, and there was already blood running down from his forehead, a deep cut where the bass headstock had split the skin open. His face was pale, almost gray, completely drained of color. For one absolutely horrible moment, Kurt thought he might actually be dead, that his best friend had just died right in front of him on live television, in front of the whole world. Dave Grohl completely abandoned his drum kit and sprinted across the stage, still clutching his drumsticks in white-knuckled hands. Oh my God, is he breathing? Kurt, is he breathing? Check if he's breathing. Kurt put his shaking hand on Chris' chest, felt it rising and falling steadily, and let out a breath he didn't know he'd been holding. Yeah, he's breathing, but he's not waking up at all. He's not responding to anything I'm saying. MTV cameras kept rolling on automatic, capturing every single second of this disaster unfolding in real time. Security guards ran onto the stage from both wings, along with paramedics who'd been stationed backstage for exactly this kind of emergency. Kurt refused to move even an inch when the paramedics tried to get him to step back so they could work. He stayed right there beside his friend, holding Chris's hand tightly, talking to him even though Chris couldn't hear or respond. "Come on, man, wake up. You've got to wake up right now. This isn't funny anymore." One of the paramedics was shining a bright pen light directly in Chris's eyes, checking for pupil response and any signs of consciousness. Another was taking his pulse carefully, checking his breathing rhythm, examining the deep cut on his forehead with practiced efficiency and obvious concern. They were speaking to each other in rapid medical terminology that Kurt didn't fully understand. Words like concussion protocol and possible skull fracture and need to immobilize the cervical spine. He understood the worried tone, though, even if he didn't know all the medical jargon. This was serious. This was very serious. "We need to get him to a hospital right now," the lead paramedic said firmly, looking directly at Kurt with an expression that made Kurt's blood run cold. "He's got a severe concussion at minimum, and we absolutely need to make sure there's no skull fracture or any brain bleeding happening." Skull fracture. Brain bleeding. These were words you heard in medical dramas on television, not words that were supposed to apply to your best friend, to the guy who could drink anyone under the table and never get sick, to the seemingly indestructible force of nature that was Krist Novoselic. They brought a stretcher onto the stage quickly, the wheels rattling loudly against the wood floor, and Kurt helped the paramedics as carefully as possible move Chris' limp body onto it. He was completely dead weight, offering no resistance or help, and it took all of them working together with coordinated effort to lift him safely without risking further injury to his neck or spine. The crowd was absolutely silent now, every single person watching this terrible scene unfold in front of them. All the chaos and explosive energy from the performance had evaporated completely, replaced by this terrible, heavy concern that filled the entire arena. As they started to wheel Chris toward the ambulance waiting backstage, with its lights already flashing, his eyes suddenly fluttered open just slightly. Confused, completely unfocused, pupils visibly different sizes, but open. "Kurt?" His voice was badly slurred, like he'd been drinking heavily, barely audible even in the now quiet arena. Kurt leaned in close, his face just inches from Chris's. "I'm right here, man. I'm not going anywhere. You're okay. You're going to be completely okay." "What happened? Why am I lying down?" "You tried to catch your bass and it caught you instead," Kurt said, desperately trying to keep his voice light and joking even though his hands were visibly shaking and he felt like he might throw up at any second. "Pretty sure you lost that fight, buddy." Chris tried to smile at the weak joke, then winced hard as the movement sent sharp pain shooting through his entire head. "Did we finish the song? Did the show end okay?" Only Christ would be lying on a stretcher with a serious head injury and still be worried about whether they'd finished the performance properly and professionally. Kurt felt tears stinging his eyes, but he blinked them back fiercely. "Yeah, man, we finished it. You made sure of that before you decided to take a nap." They wheeled Christ toward the waiting ambulance, and Kurt followed without a single moment's hesitation or second thought. He didn't care about the award show, didn't care about the cameras still filming everything, didn't care that they were supposed to stay for the rest of the ceremony and maybe give an acceptance speech if they won one of the categories they were nominated for. He was going to the hospital with his friend, and that was absolutely non-negotiable, no matter what anyone said. The ride to Cedars-Sinai felt like the longest 15 minutes of Kurt's life. The ambulance siren screamed, and Christ kept drifting in and out of consciousness, mumbling things that didn't make sense. Talking about their first show in Aberdeen, asking where his bass was, trying to sit up before paramedics gently pushed him back down. "We were supposed to play the Viper Room next week," Christ mumbled. "Yeah, don't worry," Kurt lied. "Everything's handled. I messed up the throw. The bass messed up the catch." At the hospital, they rushed Christ into emergency for a CT scan while Kurt waited in the lobby. He sat in an uncomfortable plastic chair, still wearing his stage clothes covered in Chris' dried blood, trying not to think about worst-case scenarios. Dave Grohl burst through the doors 20 minutes later. "How is he?" "They're doing scans. He woke up in the ambulance, which is a good sign." They sat in silence, two-thirds of Nirvana in a hospital waiting room. Their biggest television performance ever, and it had ended with their bassist in emergency. "You know what the worst part is," Kurt said. "MTV is probably thrilled. They got their dramatic moment. Chris gets hurt and they get ratings." 2 hours later, a doctor came out. Chris had a severe concussion and needed 12 stitches, but no skull fracture, no brain bleeding, no permanent damage. He'd need to rest for 2 weeks, but he was going to make a full recovery. Kurt felt his body sag with relief. "Can we see him?" Chris was in a hospital bed, head bandaged. He opened his eyes. "Hey, did we win?" "Win what?" "Best New Artist." Kurt started laughing. "I have no idea. We left." "Good. Too mainstream." "You scared the hell out of me." "I'm sorry. Don't do it again." "Deal. But I'm keeping the scar." The next day, the VMA incident was everywhere. MTV played the footage on repeat. But nobody talked about what Kurt did after. Not how he dropped everything for his friend. How he refused to leave Chris's side. That part didn't make the news. But for Chris, that part mattered most. "You know what I realized?" Chris said the next day. "All this fame stuff, none of it means anything if you don't have people who care about you as a person." "Yeah. You stayed with me instead of staying for the award. That's friendship. Everything else is noise." The incident changed how Nirvana approached performances. Still chaotic, still unpredictable, but with an unspoken agreement to watch out for each other. Chris recovered fully, though he still has the scar. But when asked about that night, he doesn't talk about the injury. He talks about Kurt, about how his best friend stayed. "That's when I knew we'd be okay," Chris said years later. "Not the band. That could fall apart. But the friendship was solid. When someone chooses you over an MTV award, that's love." The 1992 VMAs became legendary. The fake Rape Me opening, the bass throw, Kurt kneeling beside Chris. But for Kurt, it became a reminder of what mattered. Years later, when fame was crushing him, when everything felt fake, he would think back to that hospital moment. Chris asking if they won, both laughing because they didn't care. That was real. The bass that hit Chris is now in a museum. People take photos with it, but they miss the point. What made that moment important was Kurt's choice after Chris fell, to be a friend before being a rock star. They didn't win Best New Artist. Pearl Jam did. But sitting in that hospital room, they won something better. The knowledge that their friendship could survive anything. Even falling bass guitars even. MTV. Even fame. And that was the only award that ever really mattered.